Enlightenment itself, however, which reminds faith of the opposite aspect of its separated moments, is just as little enlightened about itself. It has a purely negative attitude to faith, so far as it excludes its own content from its purity and takes that content to be the negative of itself. It therefore neither recognizes itself in this negative in the content of faith, nor for this reason does it bring the two thoughts together, the one which it puts forward itself and the one to which it opposes the first. Since it does not recognize that which it condemns in faith as directly its own thought, it is itself in the antithesis of the two moments, only one of which, that is, in every case, the one opposed to faith, it acknowledges, but separates the other from the first just as faith does. Consequently, enlightenment does not produce the unity of both as their unity, that is, as the notion. But the notion comes into being for it of its own accord. In other words, enlightenment finds the notion there merely as something given. For in itself, the realization of pure insight is just this, that insight, whose essence is the notion, at first becomes for itself an absolute other and repudiates itself. For the antithesis of the notion is an absolute antithesis. And then out of this otherness, it comes to itself, or to its notion. But enlightenment is only this movement. It is the still unconscious activity of the pure notion, an activity which, though it does arrive at its object, takes it to be an other, and two, does not know the nature of the notion. That is, that it is the undifferentiated, which absolutely sunders itself. As against faith, then, insight is the might of the notion, insofar as it is the movement and the relating of the moments lying asunder in its consciousness, a relating in which their contradiction comes to light. Herein lies the absolute right of the authority which insight exercises over faith, but the reality on which it exercises this authority lies just in the fact that the believing consciousness is itself the notion, and therefore itself acknowledges the opposite aspect which insight puts before it. Insight, therefore, retains its right as against faith because it makes valid in faith what is necessary to faith itself and what faith possesses in itself. Paragraph 565 is a rather long one, and there is a lot going on in there. Again, we're still dealing with this dialectic between enlightenment or insight and faith, and as we saw, just in the previous paragraph, Hegel says that faith is at a disadvantage, one that he's noted several times in relation to enlightenment or insight, where really the initiative is going to be on historically. But one of the reasons for that is that the moments of faith, which compose its organic unity, turn out to be able to be brought into contradiction. They are implicitly in contradiction with each other, so long as faith remains faith. And we're going to see that charted out a little bit more in the paragraphs yet to come. So that's a starting point. And Hegel says here to begin this paragraph, enlightenment, which reminds faith of this opposite aspect of its separated moments, right? Enlightenment, which is showing faith to contain some, at least tensions, or really, quite frankly, contradictions within itself, he says, is also unenlightened about itself. So it's critical, but it's insufficiently critical. We've seen this discussed already. Enlightenment, at first, has a kind of advantage in being contentless, in looking at faith, which has determinate content, and saying, oh, that determinate content that you're working with is really just picture thinking. You're portraying the absolute or God or the divine as something finite, something conditioned, something that is essentially a human projection. And We're not doing that. We're not doing that because we're not doing anything other than looking at what you're doing and saying, no, that can't be right. And then the question that faith can respond with, and enlightenment actually has to ask itself is, okay, what are you bringing to the table other than complaints and criticisms? What are you bringing that's actually positive? And we've talked in the previous paragraphs about some of the positive content of enlightenment. Here Hegel is saying enlightenment is not yet sufficiently self-reflective. He says it has a purely negative attitude to faith insofar as it excludes its own content from its purity and takes that content to be the negative of itself. So what is that content? Who does that content belong to? I think we have to read what's going on here in a double way. There is the content that faith not only has to contribute, but consists in. It brings out, it's right there, so to speak, on its sleeve. It doesn't have to be, looked for. Faith already has a content. But as we saw, enlightenment itself has a content. And so there is indeed a kind of latent contradiction within enlightenment itself, insofar as it's this critical attitude towards any sort of determinacy, isn't even calling the absolute a void a kind of determinacy, isn't the reduction of religion to the useful a kind of determinacy, isn't the attention to the entire realm of sensuous being through a new, more enlightened, more sophisticated form of sense certainty, isn't that content? Isn't that something determinate that enlightenment then would have to look at and apply the same sort of criteria that it's applying to faith? Let's put it this way, doesn't enlightenment have to take account of its own tendencies towards idolatry just as much as it diagnoses within faith? And the answer is yes, but enlightenment is not yet doing that. Why isn't it doing that? Well, Hegel gives us the answer to that in the rest of this paragraph. It's not sufficiently taking account of its own connection to and similarity with faith. So he says, it neither recognizes itself in this negative, in the content of faith, nor for this reason does it bring the two thoughts together. What are the two thoughts? The one which it puts forward itself, and the one to which it opposes the first. Now again, we could look at that in two ways. Maybe the one which it brings forward itself is indeed faith, but the picture of faith not represented from the side of faith, faith giving its own explanations about itself, but enlightenment's viewpoint on faith. And there'd be a bit of, let's call it irony here, understanding that it's not really ironic, but is really just a duplication going on, in part because what is faith accused of by enlightenment? Of projecting a beyond, the absolute over there, and keeping the individual determinate human being over here, much the same way as the unhappy consciousness did. Is that what's going on here in this dialectic? Maybe it's also enlightenment, as we just said, trying to have its cake and eat it too, trying to be totally critical and yet having a content of its own, a content that is supposed to trump that of faith. So he says, it doesn't recognize that what it condemns in faith is directly its own thought. How is that the case? How is the thought of faith? We know that faith is a mode of thought for Hegel, right? It's going beyond culture. It's not the same thing as just the unhappy consciousness or the religion that we looked at earlier in the spirit section. It's thought that goes beyond the world. It's pure thinking in a certain sense. Is that something that insight or enlightenment is producing? Since it does not recognize what it condemns in faith is directly its own thought, he says, it is itself in the antithesis of the two moments. Antithesis here being Gegenstand. Not Gegenstand, that's object. Sorry. The antithesis here is this opposition between the two. And it's placing them in a sort of not quite contradiction. The term here is not as strong as Widerspruch, right? The antithesis is also going to turn up within the notion in this paragraph again. So what does Hegel have to say? He says it doesn't recognize that it is, that is, enlightenment is in the antithesis of the two moments. What are the two moments? Insight and faith. Only one of which, he says, in every case, the one opposed to faith, it acknowledges. What's going on here? What is Hegel talking about here? Does this make sense? It does. Again, we have to revert back to thinking about this. Enlightenment creates a picture of faith. It creates its own imagination of what faith is up to, what faith consists in. We saw much earlier that there's these three moments of faith as faith understands itself, and then we have the moments of enlightenment understanding those very moments and understanding it in a very different way, which seems to enlightenment to get at the real heart of the matter. It tells faith what faith is really up to. But we saw that faith can respond and say, oh, you've missed some things here. Insofar as enlightenment is critiquing faith, it's critiquing something that is its own projection onto faith. It can never truly be fair to faith and treat faith as a genuine equal or partner so long as it is misconstruing it. But that is of the very nature, historically, of the Enlightenment. So, we see, for example, the modern condemning the pre-modern as being superstition and not, therefore, for that matter, not actually looking at what was going on, say, during the Dark Ages, reading some of the literature, investigating whether the Dark Ages were truly as dark as they were represented, or whether the roots of the Enlightenment didn't come out of those pretend Dark Ages. The High Middle Ages, for example, the Renaissance coming out of that. So he goes on and he says, it separates faith and enlightenment out from each other. It creates a sort of division between them that faith can also recognize. Faith will return fire, right? But enlightenment is really the one who's creating this absolute division. So he says it acknowledges this. And then he says, consequently, enlightenment fails to do something important. What is the mission of enlightenment here? What is enlightenment supposed to be doing? He says, enlightenment does not produce the unity of both as their unity, that is, as the notion, as the Begriff, right? The concept that's so central to the Hegelian dialectic. Enlightenment doesn't produce this unity of both of them as their unity, but the notion, he says, comes into being for it of its own accord. The notion is going to come into being whether enlightenment likes it or not. It's a question of whether enlightenment actually grasps the notion adequately, not whether the notion adequately presents itself to enlightenment. Enlightenment has to do more work than it's actually doing. So he says, in other words, enlightenment finds the notion there merely as something given, something vorhanden, right out there, ready to be picked up, the way I pick up this piece of chalk or use this chalkboard. I take it for granted. Enlightenment takes the notion for granted. Enlightenment takes the concept for granted. and thereby doesn't actually realize it, doesn't make it actual. So he says, in itself, the realization of pure insight is just this. That insight whose essence is the notion at first becomes for itself an absolute other and repudiates itself. This is what goes on with the Hegelian notion. This self and other, those are really part of the same notion. They are really part of the same fundamental dynamic. I can't say thing. I was tempted to say thing there, but the same dynamic system, you might say. So he goes on and he says, the antithesis of the notion is an absolute antithesis. Now, the German doesn't actually spell out absolute antithesis. It just says the antithesis of the notion is absolute. But what is absolute in that case? Well, the antithesis. So the absolute here is what we've been striving after, isn't it? It's what faith was aiming at. What Enlightenment said, you are mistaking faith. You're thinking that it's just some sort of, thing that you can wrap your head around, or some airy, ethereal, beyond that you can't really talk about. You're just reverting to a kind of mysticism. Let's substitute a void of predicates in its place as a more adequate concept. And we saw that's not really an adequate concept at all, right? Nobody's actually grasping the notion here. And nobody's realizing the antithesis that's taking place. So it's important from the phenomenologist perspective to bring that antithesis to light. So he says, out of this otherness, it comes to itself or to its notion. And notice what he says now. Enlightenment is only this movement. It is the still unconscious activity of the pure notion. It is being harnessed by the notion, but rather than the notion being a tool of enlightenment, enlightenment is a tool of the notion. The consciousness of enlightenment is not fully conscious. There's some unconscious element or dimension to it. So he goes on and he says, this is an activity which, although it does arrive at its object, it takes it to be an other. And it doesn't know the nature of the notion. That the notion is the undifferentiated, which absolutely sunders itself. So it's the undifferentiated which differentiates itself into a dynamic system. Enlightenment should grasp the fact that in the notion, it is harnessed to faith. It can't get away from faith. It can't purify the world of faith and have just enlightenment in its place. So he goes on and he says, as against faith, insight is the might of the notion, insofar as it's the movement and the relating of the moments lying asunder in its consciousness, a relating in which their contradictions come to light. All right? The contradictions of the moments of faith. But enlightenment should also be noting its own contradictions, as well as the contradiction between itself and faith. So he says, this is the absolute right of the authority which insight exercises over faith. Insight turns out to be a bit mistaken about what its authority is. It would like to say, well, I'm pure reason. I'm not, I'm purifying rationality of all this dregs of religiosity and its origins in religious thinking. Let's get rid of all that stuff, or at least suspend it so then we can turn it against the actually existing faith being exercised in the world, and maybe we'll get rid of that as well. Hegel's saying that's not really where the authority of enlightenment is coming from. He says it's the reality on which it exercises its authority lies just in the fact that the believing consciousness is itself the notion. Now, isn't that an interesting thing to say? The authority for this side of the equation, an equation here in a very metaphorical sense, the adequating across the antithesis, the becoming adequate to, by way of becoming the notion, takes place through grasping that faith is also central to the notion. So enlightenment, if it does eradicate faith, it eradicates what it needs in order to exist. It destroys its raison d'etre, right? So he goes on and he says, therefore it acknowledges the opposite aspect which insight puts before it. Insight retains its right as against faith because it makes valid in faith what is necessary to faith itself and what faith possesses in itself. So we see, as opposed to the previous paragraph, where it looked like, enlightenment really had the upper hand over faith because it could be conscious of, it could turn faith and its moments against itself and say, look, you've got these inherent contradictions. Enlightenment is going to be what allows faith to be realized fully as faith. Now, this is going to be a bitter pill for many people of faith to swallow, especially in our modern times after this dialectic has taken place. But that's the way that Hegel is representing what is going on between insight and faith in the time period of the Enlightenment. At first, enlightenment affirms this moment of the notion that it is an act of consciousness. Opposing faith, it maintains that the absolute being of faith is a being of the believer's own consciousness qua self, or that this absolute being is a product of consciousness. To faith, its absolute being, while it is possessed of intrinsic being for the believer, is also at the same time not like an alien thing which is just found in him, no one knowing how and whence it came. On the contrary, the faith of the believer consists just in his finding himself as this particular personal consciousness in the absolute being, and his obedience and service consist in producing through his own activity that being as his own absolute being. Enlightenment, strictly speaking, only reminds faith of this if faith roundly asserts that the in itself of absolute being is beyond the activity of consciousness. But while enlightenment, it is true, corrects the one-sidedness of faith by bringing to its notice the opposite moment of action in contrast to being, and it is being which faith is alone thinking of here, and yet does not itself bring its own thoughts together, it isolates the pure moment of action and asserts that the in itself of faith is only a product of consciousness. This action taken in isolation and opposed to the in itself is, however, a contingent action, and qua an activity of picture thinking is a creating of fictions, picture thoughts, which possess no intrinsic being, and this is how enlightenment regards the content of faith. But conversely, pure insight equally says the reverse. In maintaining the moment of otherness which the notion has within it, it pronounces absolute being to be for faith something which in no way concerns consciousness, lies beyond it, is alien to it, and unknown. The case is similar with faith. On the one hand, it puts its trust in absolute being, and in doing so obtains the certainty of itself. On the other hand, for faith, absolute being is unsearchable in all its ways and in its being unattainable. Paragraph 566 continues this story of the conflict and really productive dynamic between faith and insight or enlightenment in this historical period. And we find that faith is in the process of learning more about itself and about its relation to its own object at the same time that enlightenment is learning about itself in relation to faith. And of course, both of them in relation to the absolute and the notion. So Hegel says enlightenment affirms this moment of the notion that it is an act of consciousness, right? That consciousness is what is driving this. And he says, opposing faith, it maintains that the absolute being of faith is a being of the believer's own consciousness qua a self, or that this absolute being is a product of consciousness. Nothing new here, right? Absolute being, God, the divine, is really a projection of the individual, or we might say of a social assemblage, a consciousness carried out within the society. It's some sort of projection of humanity outside to a beyond, and we attribute all sorts of cool things to the absolute being, and in contrast to it, we are nothing but lowly worms, right? So Enlightenment says, look, that's what's going on, faith. That's what you're in the business of doing. So he says, to faith, however, its absolute being, while it is possessed of intrinsic being for the believer, is at the same time not like an alien being, which is just found in him, some sort of ideas, right? No one knowing how and whence it came. There's a more personal relationship between the individual believer and what is being believed in, what one has faith in. So he goes on and he says, the faith of the believer consists just in his finding himself as this particular personal consciousness in the absolute being. And there's a bit more in that sentence, but let's pause there for a moment. The believer, instead of simply saying, I'm going to project this aspect of myself, everything that's good, everything that's, essential out this way, the believer actually finds him or herself within the context of the relation to the absolute being. As what? How do they find themselves? Well, this is where we get to the very interesting portion of this. Here, Hegel talks about something that should be familiar to us now, because he's talked about it many times throughout the phenomenology, the domain of action. And in religion, what does action consist in? Many different things. Here he talks about obedience and service. Obeying the absolute being. Showing service of some sort to the absolute being. These are things that people do. This is how they commit themselves. This is how they live out a relationship with the absolute being. Faith, you might say, to paraphrase something, without works is dead faith, right? An important letter. So we go on, and he says, this obedience and service consist in producing, through his own activity, that being, the absolute being, as his own absolute being. It's an appropriation. It's an affiliation of oneself with the absolute being. Now, this doesn't mean simply, projecting our wishes or desires onto the absolute being and saying, oh, lucky me, I found them there, or anything like that, because something is demanded. Some action, some sacrifice is required in this case. And we're going to see Hegel talking about this again in terms of mortification a few paragraphs from now. So he says, Enlightenment, strictly speaking, only reminds faith of this. If faith asserts that the in itself of absolute being is beyond the activity of consciousness, Enlightenment could be doing the job of telling faith, hey, you actually have a humanized divine. You actually have a divine that you can relate to. And he says, so Enlightenment can correct the one-sidedness of faith by bringing to its notice the opposite moment of action in contrast to mere being. I'm using the word mere there. Hegel doesn't say mere being, but action is what is dynamic in this situation, and being is just what is thought, what is being projected there, what is being left as in itself in this case. So he says Enlightenment can do this, but Enlightenment, he says, doesn't bring its own thoughts together, right? It isolates the pure moment of action and asserts that the in itself of faith is only a product of consciousness. It's not a product of, we might say, encounter, of engagement. So he talks about Enlightenment looking at this action in isolation. He says this action taken in isolation, opposed to the in itself, is a contingent action and is an activity of picture thinking. The believer is engaged, once again, we see Vorstellung, imagination, representation, picture thinking, not as good as the concept. But as we just saw in the last several paragraphs, Enlightenment doesn't have a monopoly on the concept, right? The concept is greater than enlightenment by itself or belief by itself or faith by itself. So he says, from the perspective of enlightenment, faith is this contingent action, a creating of fictions, picture thoughts which possess no intrinsic being. And this is how he says enlightenment regards the content of faith. And then he says, but that can't be all that enlightenment or insight really thinks. He says, pure insight also says the reverse. So we've got a problem here. Enlightenment is saying two things about faith. Which of them is true? Which of them is actually going to be the case? Well, both of them have to be true in a sense. How's that going to happen? Well, let's see what he says. In maintaining the moment of otherness which the notion has within it, enlightenment produces absolute being to be for faith something which in no way concerns consciousness, lies beyond it, is alien to it, and unknown. The case is similar with faith. On the one hand, it puts its trust in absolute being, and in doing so obtains the certainty of itself. On the other hand, for faith, absolute being is unsearchable in all its ways, and in its being unattainable. Hegel here is saying that there's a double problem of trying to have two thoughts about, what the other is in this case, that are, in some sense, at least at this point, incompatible. Right? So how is this going to be reconciled? Well, we're going to see this happen a little bit in the next few paragraphs, and then a bit more in the next section.